My current book project looks ethnographically at Mara Salvatrucha, or MS13. It's a transnational street gang that started in Los Angeles, but then has since been deported back to the Northern Cone in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Currently, there are 100,000 members throughout the Americas, as far north as Toronto, as far south as Lima, and as far-ranging as Alaska and Spain. It's this incredibly violent, incredibly vocal, incredibly public criminal network. A growing amount of social scientific research explores how men and women join MS13, why they join, the conditions under which they join. My current project looks at disaffiliation, at the only ways out of MS13. The first is death, and the second is Christian conversion. And now there's a growing, because of this way out, there's a growing cadre of Protestant ministers throughout Central America, gang ministers, that work with active members of MS13 to pull them out of gang life. And that alone is interesting. That alone, I think, is important in terms of delinquency, rehabilitation, questions of salvation. In many ways, this project is the underside of citizenship. Principally, MS13 is a problem because of security. 100,000 gang members in Central America, especially in Guatemala and El Salvador, traffic product, particularly cocaine, from the Andes to the United States. At least that's one of their money-making ventures. 90% of the cocaine that flows through the Andes to the United States goes through Guatemala because of the increased militarization of Mexico by the US. Guatemala is now a port of entry. That kind of movement, mixed with a post-war violence, makes Mara Salvatrucha, or MS13, a problem in its own right. 17 murders a day in Guatemala, only 2% of crime leads in a conviction. Crime and violence in post-war Guatemala is a problem, and gangs are a major part of that. But when you add Christianity, when you add these transnational efforts at rehabilitation and intervention, funding gang ministers in Central America, throughout the Americas, MS13 stops being a problem by way of violence or drugs and begins to be a moral problem. MS13 remained a very modest gang up until 1992, when the LA riots and the rise of the moral majority in the United States shifted dramatically deportation policies, such that men and women without firm citizenship status in the US could be deported for something as small as shoplifting. And since the LA riots, roughly 1996, the deportation of Central Americans from the United States has increased dramatically. There was a little over 8,000 deported in 1996. That tripled by 2004 to 24,000 Central Americans. And since 9/11 and the rise and the war on terror, that number, 24,000, has since tripled to 75,000 in 2007. Deporting Central Americans with either criminal backgrounds or affiliated with criminal activity, or even just charged with criminality, returned back to Central America. Of importance to realize is that many of these men and women deported from Los Angeles came to Los Angeles when they're quite young. They grew up in the LA public school system. They don't speak Spanish as well as they speak English. They have no familial ties in Central America. And as the US deported tens of thousands after tens of thousands of Central Americans from Los Angeles, not disclosing criminal records to Central American countries, just putting them on planes, dropping them off in Central America, the only real ties that these men and women had was with Mara Salvatrucha, or MS13. And if they didn't have ties before, then they did then. MS13 as a transnational gang, it's important to note, isn't an organized crime because it lacks a certain degree of organization. MS13 is comprised of what are called cliques, or small communities that stretch from Toronto to Lima. Each clique has their own precedents and their own kind of understanding of whether Christianity is in fact a way out. Many cliques in Guatemala right now aren't recognizing Christianity as a viable means of leaving MS13. But for those cliques that do, they see a disjuncture, a missed point of contact between a Christian way of life and life in MS13, and recognize that change, that conversion narrative, that experience of a new life as not being in agreement with the life of an active member of MS13, and so they allow the men and women to leave. The important thing to note, to realize, just because you convert out of MS13 doesn't mean that you convert out of the vendettas you've accrued over your either short or long lifespan. And a lot of those men and women who convert out of MS-13 quickly die or are killed. The interest for me, ethnographically, anthropologically, as someone interested in transnationalism, is the way that even in spite of the dangers of converting out of MS-13, even in spite of the very few numbers of actual men and women who've converted out and who've stayed out, I'm interested in the movement of capital, of aid, of support from North American churches and aid organizations that support this effort. Because amid unprecedented homicide rates, amid a gang that keeps on growing and terrorizing not just Los Angeles and San Salvador and Guatemala City, but the Washington, D.C. area, increasingly New York, Chicago, Toronto, this seems like the only viable answer. And I'm interested in that desperate grasp towards reducing MS-13, towards gang abatement, but also the unintended consequences, like making the train by which we can secure the Americas is the soul, that making the soul the very train by which you can secure the Americas. That's the focus of the project.